All right, we're going to get started. So hopefully everybody can view our starting slide there. Thank you all for joining the Pollinator Steward webinar series number 5, Creating Meadows for Pollinators. I'll start here with a few minutes of introductions and then we'll get into the presentation. So this webinar series has been created by Pollinator Partnership Canada along with partners Habitat Acquisition Trust, Saanich Native Plants, and Parks Canada. My name is Amy Peltier and I'm a Species at Risk Engagement Officer working out of Gulf Islands National Park Reserve and also Fort Rod Hill and Biscard Lighthouse National Historic Sites of Canada. And I'm joined today by panelists who will introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Laura Morandin from Pollinator Partnership Canada, and then next we'll go to Paige Erickson McGee from Habitat Acquisition Trust, and then Kristen Miskelly from Saanich Native Plants.
Hi all, thanks for being here. I'm Laura Morandin. I'm the Acting Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada and the Acting Research Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada and Pollinator Partnership US. We are the largest organization in the world dedicated exclusively to the protection of pollinators and their ecosystems. And we do this through education and outreach, habitat creation, policy advising, collaboration, and other forms as well. So I'm happy to be here, and I'll be helping to moderate this webinar. So you can send your questions in, and I'll be asking them of the speakers at the end of the webinar presentations.
Hi everybody, my name's Paige and I am the Stewardship Coordinator at Habitat Acquisition Trust, or HAT, and we are the regional land trust for the CRD, or the Greater Victoria area, including the Southern Gulf Islands, and we help people understand and care for natural habitats in their backyards. We help folks protect different land, create parks, and education and outreach all about nature. We're excited to be here and working with the other partners, so thank you so much.
I think we may have lost Kristen for the moment being, but we'll be able to introduce her as one of our speakers later.
My apologies, Amy. Can you see and hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Miskelly. I'm with Saanich Native Plants and really happy to be here. We're a local native plant nursery who works to grow native plants and seeds and works on various different restoration projects.
Thank you. So today we're talking about pollinators and their interaction with plants, and these are intricate and ancient relationships, and protecting them is essential. It is also important at all times to be aware that both the plants and animals are part of stewarded First Nations territories and are considered relatives to Coast Salish peoples of our area. There are 9 nations in the Victoria area, which you'll see here. Esquimalt and Songhees Nation, collectively known as the Lekwungen speaking peoples, Shiano and Suk First Nation, and then the 5 nations in the Saanich territory, Pakwachin, Sayout, Sartlip, Sakum, and Malahat. So opportunities for education about plants and animals are a real honor for us here today, and we hope that there is appreciation and stewardship garnered for nature through raising awareness. I'd also like to thank our webinar sponsors that have made this possible to provide the webinar free of charge. These include Pollinator Partnership Canada, Habitat Acquisition Trust, Saanich Native Plants, and Parks Canada, and we have also received contributions from Whole Foods, Van City, and the Growing Together initiative to support this series. So this series includes 10 webinars, and information on each webinar can be found on the Island Pollinator Initiative website. Our next webinar in the series is now open for registration, and it will take place next Tuesday, August 11th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And our guest presenter, Bianca Elliott, will be focusing on Indigenous stewardship in Saanich and Lekwungen territories. I hope you'll join us for that. And here are just some of the other webinars that are coming up, and we're going to be releasing them sequentially every 1 to 2 weeks from now until the fall. Recordings of the webinars will be made available on the IPI website after each one is completed, so you're always welcome to watch it a second time, and you're welcome to share it with others. Well, there we go. So we've also designed the webinar series so that people can take them to become a certified pollinator steward if you are interested. Becoming a certified pollinator steward through Pollinator Partnership Canada shows that you have a science-based understanding of pollinators and pollinator conservation, and that you've taken action to help pollinators. Again, you can see the IPI webinar page for more details, and if it does interest you, you can email Laura, and her email is on the page there, and she will put you on a list of people interested and will send you more information. All right, so for today's talk, here are some logistics. The presentation period is about an hour long. We're having 2 presentations today, so each half an hour. There'll be then half an hour or 20 minutes at the end for question and answers. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Paige and Laura will be monitoring the Q&A, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Note that you can change how you view the webinar and the speaker layout through your webinar controls, and feel free to use the chat function to speak with one of us if you have technical problems, but please put your questions in the Q&A. All right, it's worth staying to the end of the presentation because we are awarding 2 prizes today. So we have a moderator's favorite question award, which will be chosen by the moderator for the most interesting or thought-provoking question. And it's this set of beeswax food wraps with a little bee print from Goldilocks. There will also be a second prize, which is a speaker's gift award. And you'll have a choice of one of these toques or a ball cap from Parks Canada. And the winner will be selected by today's speakers. All right. So we're going to move into today's presentation, and I'll introduce the first speaker, who is Kristen Miskelly. So Kristen is a biologist passionate about ecosystem restoration, native plants, and native plant propagation. She specializes in the botany and ecology of southern Vancouver Island and co-founded Saanich Native Plants, a local native plant nursery and consulting business dedicated to conserving, enhancing, and appreciating local ecosystems. And Kristen enjoys teaching a wide range of courses. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kristen.
Thanks, Amy, and welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar. It's certainly a topic near and dear to my heart, so I'm really pleased to be here and be able to do this with everybody. I'd like to start with a scene like this that looks so familiar to many of us. Meadows like this, like the one you're seeing here, are increasingly rare, unfortunately, but were once widespread across southern Vancouver Island. In our area, we call meadow systems like this Garry Oak ecosystems. But interestingly, to the south in Washington and through Oregon, these same meadows and ecosystems are called prairie oak instead of Garry Oak ecosystem. And that phrasing really emphasizes the fact that Garry Oak ecosystems don't necessarily have to contain Garry Oak trees, although many of them do. It's not essential. Instead, Garry Oak ecosystems really are a variety of ecosystems that are defined by a characteristic suite of species of flora and fauna. That includes various wildflowers that are familiar to us, like herbaceous flowering plants called forbs. There's bunch grasses, sedges, rushes, and much more as well. In setting the context for today's talk, part of why I'm giving sort of this preamble ahead is because having an understanding of our local ecology really helps inform our restoration activities, and that includes making meadows. So this image here is a really special image. This is the first vegetation map that was ever developed of the Victoria area. and it's from 1842. And I've marked there where present-day UVic is, and then also where Fort Victoria is. So that's right at Victoria's Inner Harbor, where Fort Street is. And at the time this map was drawn, all European settlers were concentrated at Fort Victoria. And of course, the landscape was, Indigenous peoples had been living here for thousands of years, living and thriving here. And there's a legend associated with this map that you're unable to see. It's so faded on this depiction, but the darker parts of the map that you're seeing, so those blacks and grays, are keyed as a mix of woodland, forest, and swamp. And then all of the white, the pale colored areas, those are all were depicted as prairie and plains. And so this map really highlights just how widespread meadowlands were at the time. So a bunch widespread treeless landscapes, and you can just imagine the meadows and oak trees and savannas that were widespread only quite a short time ago. Indigenous oral histories, charcoal, pollen records, and historical accounts show that the effects of Indigenous land management, including which were clever, strategic, purposeful, and often included fire as a main management tool, really kept meadows and the landscapes we're familiar with as Garry Oak ecosystems thriving here. And those activities were occurring over thousands of years. And there are, of course, abiotic factors driving the suite of unique species that are characteristic here. So that we're in the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains, and consequently we have really quite low rainfall in Victoria. So the graph you're seeing there is average precipitation in January and average precipitation in July, and it's contrasted with three fairly wet, local wet climates, as well as three arid climates. And you can see how even our winter rainfall is quite low compared to some of the nearby rainforest climates like Tofino and Prince Rupert and Slell on Haida Gwaii, while the summer precipitation is really striking. We indeed have the lowest average precipitation in summer in all of Canada. I had mentioned some of the settler accounts that really are striking in terms of the expansiveness of meadowlands here. So 15 years after the first vegetation map of the Victoria area was created, these particular settler accounts demonstrate the expansiveness of local meadows. So I'm gonna paraphrase a bit as I go here, but Captain Grant writes in 1857, "On the west side of Petter Bay is a fine open prairie extending nearly across to Beecher Bay. It contains some 700 acres and is interspersed with oak trees. The soil is rich and it is well watered, there being several springs throughout it. The land is level and consists of rich black mold some 3 feet in depth." So for those that aren't familiar, Petter Bay is the Chosen area. And then in Joseph Pemberton in 1860 writes, "Of Vancouver Island, the southern portion only has been examined and is found to contain 100,000 acres. And that number is really striking, but 100,000 acres of valuable farming land in the immediate vicinity of Victoria, extending to Cowichan, which again is found to contain about the same quantity of open land, which adjoins some 30,000 acres of open land at Nanaimo." And he continues there. Since colonization, so looking at those bottom images, so we're looking at that 1842 map, and then you know, a modern day depiction of what we've done to those meadowlands. Since colonization, we've managed to almost entirely eliminate the original meadows, and we've altered the landscape so drastically that much of this prairie landscape is completely unrecognizable. We're currently left with small, degraded, isolated parcels that are often relegated to rocky outcrops and shallow soils that were basically left alone because they were too hard to farm or develop. If we continue along that same trajectory, as we continue to today, there's going to be little left, and that includes in parks. So this picture showing Beacon Hill, so on the right there is a modern day shot of the bluffs at Beacon Hill. And on the left, not that long ago, so that's, you know, the 1950s, the camas and bunch grasses and you know, species like the various native carrot species and so on in that same spot. Just to say that if we continue on that trajectory, even within parklands, we can't conserve what we have if we continue with those same activities. So the meadowlands that are here are not only endangered in British Columbia, but they're endangered to the south of us as well. And because of these activities that I've been talking about that are degrading habitat through development, invasive species, and other issues, as a result, we have a really high density of rare species, and that includes plants, of course. And in fact, we're home, like the Victoria area is home to 20% of the plants listed under the Species at Risk Act. There are a lot of ways we can help, and I really think that today's talk, that's really what it is about. How can we help with conserving our local ecosystems and species? And there are, in fact, many ways to help. And there's everything from conserving and enhancing natural areas that you may have on your own property, all the way to volunteering in a natural area. And for folks that may not be physically able or unable in other ways, there are still a variety of ways to help through education and raising awareness and so on. And degraded spaces like lawns, boulevards, ornamental gardens, and so on are opportunities for us to participate, to reduce species decline, and to really honor this ancient meadow landscape that should be here. So for folks that really are, you know, eager to get started and recognize that planting native species and creating habitat for pollinators through meadow making and want to get started is really what this talk is about today. So because of how much time we have, we're not going to get into how to restore really degraded meadows per se, but it's more about making a meadow where it's otherwise completely gone. So like lawns are a good example, or boulevards or highway medians and that kind of stuff. So, so how do you get started if that's what you want to do? Well, the first thing I think is to choose a place and define an area that you would like to do something like that. And you want to be choosing a fairly sunny location, and part shade's fine too, but of course the species would be different then and aren't really a part of today's presentation. Today's more about a sunny spot. I think jotting down key features of your site, and consider doing a sketch. And it doesn't mean you have to be artful or anything like that, but it'll help you with your layout and decide what kind of features might you want there. And observing your site in terms of moisture, light, soil, and other features. And it's really important to do your own research and to reach out. So I'm just going to flip sides for a moment to just highlight a few local resources. And these were highlighted in the Planting for Pollinators webinar, but many of you will recognize some of those resources in the images, and as well a list of local organizations and partners who are available for education, and I strongly encourage you to reach out to some of them. And I really am a strong believer in volunteerism. I think partnering up with a like-minded group of folks and having an action-oriented approach to conservation is important. So for those that are able, I encourage you to volunteer with a local organization. Planning your planting materials ahead of time is really important. And I think that's a step that is part of that kind of research phase. So decide what you're gonna plant, decide if you're gonna do that from pot or if you're gonna try it from seed or maybe a mix of both. Choosing native species that best suit your site is really important. So for example, if you're looking to create a drought tolerant meadow, it doesn't mean you can just throw in any native species. It means you need to select species that are particularly drought tolerant and fit your site conditions. And if you pick the appropriate species, you'll experience more success over the long term regardless. Plan how you're going to prepare the area. So we are going to talk about a few different techniques, and Amy will also highlight in depth some techniques. And draft a quick budget and make sure you're not biting off more than you can chew. And that means in terms of budget, but also just the space you're trying to work on to start. And it includes the active preparation and planting phase, but part of your considerations is also the maintenance into the future. And for those folks that, if you think that maybe there are some native plants embedded into a place that you want to work, be sure to do baseline surveys and have sort of the do no harm policy ahead of doing some of the techniques we're about to talk about. The techniques we're going to talk about really are where there aren't any existing native species to be concerned about. So sometimes that form of restoration is called blank slate. You also hear de novo, but these are a situation where no native vegetation is present. So you can expect the following techniques to very likely kill existing plants there. So some of the techniques we're going to cover today are smothering, tilling, sheet mulching, and we just make a quick note about mechanical removal, which just means, you know, digging out what's there, or there, for lawns, you can rent a machine called a sod stripper, which is just a push along that is designed to lift sod up. And following any of these techniques, you would then follow up with native plant and seed additions so that you can establish some vegetation in the place. So the first technique I want to talk about is smothering. And when I use the word smother, I'm talking about using a piece of material that doesn't let light penetrate. So landscape fabric does let light penetrate. So instead for smothering, we'll often use black plastic or even pond liner if the species are aggressive. And there's a variety of materials that kind of fall within both of those, but you get the idea that it's kind of a heavy-ish piece of material that keeps light out of an area for an extended period of time. And what that does over time is it kills the vegetation below. And you've probably, you know, happened upon that coincidentally just by, you know, you put, if you imagine your lawn in the summer and you put down a small kiddie pool, or you put a heavy box down, and when you lift that box up or that pool up, the grass below has been killed. And that's all you're doing in this situation. And again, you would only do something, you'd be careful about doing something like this to make sure you're not harming things you shouldn't be harming. And you also want to be a bit strategic about how you place a material like this. So working out from an edge is a good idea. So in this case, you can see a native hedgerow just at the back there. And so you're not just working in a sea of non-native plants that might colonize that area after you lift the material up. So you smother until the underlying vegetation is dead, and then you remove that material ahead of planting. So in that top right image, you're looking at the same spot after that material's been pulled up. And then, as many of you are familiar with, soils are often left with a weedy seed bank. So those are ungerminated seeds that over many, many years have fallen into that soil. And once you reduce the competition, they're left exposed to moisture and light, and it'll trigger them to grow or to germinate. And so ahead of seeding or planting, what we'll often do is we'll cover that area with some soil or mulch or some sort of material that will prevent those seeds in the underlying layer from germinating. And then at this stage where there's the new black soil, that's when we would plant or seed. And so this picture is all that same spot within a season. So this is the summer, here's late summer, this comes up, we put the soil on, we plant it in the fall, and by that following spring, you can have a nice array of plants, pollinator-friendly plants. So tilling is a tool that can be really effective, particularly over larger parcels. And I recognize there's concerns with tilling, of course, because you are, turning the soil, so you're disturbing the soil. But in some cases, I do think it definitely has applicability. So some of the tips, if you are using kind of like, you can have a tractor with a till attached, but you can also use something small like a rototiller. You want to till, or if you're using heavier machinery, you want to try to do that when you're reducing compaction to some extent. So I did put here till when soil is dry. There is a point when the soil is probably too dry. So maybe I should have put kind of like dry to medium moisture or something like that. But you kind of want to have that balance between reducing compaction, but also not sinking your machine into, moist soil or it being crazy, crazy dry and it just blows away. Again, the soil will be full of weedy seeds. So you have to think about how are you going to control that weedy seed bank? And we're going to talk about a couple techniques there. And repeated tilling, you can convert the plants that are there. So you can get rid of some and others will colonize and you kind of tip the balance. But I don't really believe you can so-called exhaust the seed bank. Sometimes you hear folks talk about that, but my experiences and what I've heard of experiences of others is that given time, you just have more and more species germinating. So this first case example, this is a mix of tilling and sheet mulching. So here's a site we helped work on where ahead of this sheet mulching, we tilled the area and then we set up a few different experimental plots doing sheet mulching and sort of did different applications of planting and seeding densities and all that kind of stuff. But this does show you the basic concept of sheet mulching. So you put down a layer of cardboard and then you top that cardboard with some kind of material. So that can be things like degraded leaf mulch, it could be compost, it could be soil, but you have this sandwich effect. And Amy will talk quite a bit about sheet mulching. So in this image, what you're seeing is those same cardboard squares. We've topped it with degraded sheet mulch, and then we've planted from plugs and pots and then added some seed. And in the bottom right there, there's a picture of a hori-hori knife. So that's a small Japanese style tool that allows you to punch through the cardboard and plant the plants that you're going to plant without disturbing too much soil. So if you imagine in the sheet mulching, you've covered up the weedy seed bank because those seeds will germinate. So you want to be a bit delicate there with your planting. You just make an incision through the cardboard into the ground, plant your plant, and that's that. So the same site, first spring after it was planted. You can see lots of Western buttercups and many other species there. And by the second spring, things are looking really good. You're looking at field chickweed and sea blush and lots of bunch grasses and a variety of species. So planted densely enough and with appropriate species, you can get really good cover quite quickly when you're planting meadows. So with seed bank control, in that top left image, you're looking at sheet mulching with that cardboard and leaf mulch. In the case of sheet mulching, you've already controlled the seed bank because the underlying soil is covered in the first step ahead of planting. Then this picture again is where the black plastic was pulled up and then you covered with a material to block the seed bank. And this bottom picture is a different technique, and it's called solarization. In the case of solarization, you're actually heating the top layers of the soil to a point where you're killing the seed bank. So it allows you to, if you have an area where you can't bring a bunch of material in, or that's prohibitive because of costs or accessibility or whatever it may be, using clear plastic can be effective at dealing with that seed bank. So the technique, you put clear, not black, but clear plastic poly down onto, we've just been doing it on bare soil, but there are people who put it over some vegetation as well. And you put that down over an entire summer. Ahead of doing so, you water the soil and you also seal the edges. So what you're looking at here is a picture that a friend Teresa sent me, who is working on an area on her property. So she moistened the soil before, put clear plastic, weighted it down with rocks. And why it looks white, it's actually clear plastic, but it looks white because of all that humidity. So it's kind of like a greenhouse effect, and it's causing droplets to form inside the plastic. And so she'll leave that down over the summer, and then she'll pull that up in fall. At that time, what Teresa will do, she's going to seed the area. She won't actually plant it with tools, because what she wants to minimize is soil disturbance. So if you can imagine, after that plastic comes up, she's killed this weedy seed bank, the last thing she wants to do is bring all those weed seeds back up to the surface. So she'll scatter her own seed mix and be careful not to disturb the soil. After seeding a site, so if you imagine you're seeding in fall, which makes sense biologically if you think about when our native plants are dropping seeds in the wild through spring and summer, then it rains, then some things start to germinate. This is what a place that you've solarized would look like for much of the winter. So some of these leaves, I can see a yarrow there, and there's lots of sea blush that's already germinated. And by first spring after a seeding, you'll see if sown at an appropriate density. So this is a spot that was solarized, seeded in fall, and then you're seeing a mix of species that grow and germinate quite quickly in the first spring. And here's that same spot in future years. So you can see the stalk of last year's yarrow, but you're seeing some of the perennials filling in, like spring golds, Western buttercup, sea blush. Here's some California brome and so on. So one thing we tried one year was putting down camas bulbs before we solarized. So we buried them really deeply. You can see how deep those pits are. And we used very mature, great camas bulbs, put them down into those holes. Then we covered with plastic to kill the weedy seed bank, and then did the same thing as I've been discussing, where we, lifted the plastic, then we sowed our seed mix. But with those underlying camas bulbs, it allowed us to have species included in that first year that would otherwise take many years to bloom. So here's great camas. It takes 7 years to bloom from seed. So if you put it in a seed mix, you have to wait 7 years to see it. But we learned that you can include them under solarization plastic and they can still thrive. And more pictures of that same spot. This would be year 2 of that area. I also wanted to mention, we've been looking at some images of meadows where we're sowing seeds and there's quite a random appearance, but if sort of a tidier or grouped appearance appeals to you more, like swaths of plants and that sort of thing, you can easily do that in meadows. You can either have your seeds separated instead of mixed, or you can, one of the easiest ways to do it is just to do it from pot, and being strategic about how you plant and about how you're lumping your plants together. And you have a more kind of structured appearance to whatever you're planting. So choosing materials and planning your planting materials ahead is really important. I wanted to just highlight a few things to be thinking about. So these are called plugs. And what they allow you to do, they are, you know, grown in a container type thing, but what they allow for is covering a wide area fairly inexpensively. And it's sort of, if you had a larger space, you might think about using units like that instead of larger pots. And here's pictures of camas bulbs, and I just showed you an example, excuse me, of how camas bulbs can be effective in adding them in. Here's a beautiful seed mix. So there's woolly sunflowers and sea blush and camas and California oatgrass and blue-eyed grass. And certainly, you know, working with seed, I love using seed for restoration projects or for making meadows. I think it gives, well, first of all, it allows you to cover a large area super economically and gives you a really kind of natural distribution of plants when a seed mix is designed appropriately. And so, you know, I don't expect that, you know, everyone's going to just know how much seed of which species to add into a mix. So you do want to reach out for some help with that kind of stuff. But if you get a good mix that is appropriate to your site, you can have really excellent results fairly quickly. When you're working with seed, one of the first things I started to recognize with seed is that you got to be careful not to bury it too deeply, or you'll limit what can germinate. And so a good rule of thumb is to sow the seed as deep as the seed is wide. And the seeds in the hands in this photo are showing you kind of small range seeds, but the main seeds you're seeing of spring gold here are fairly large. But even then, you can just scatter these more or less on the surface with just a very, very light raking, and that's about all you need to do to get those to germinate effectively. Over larger areas, you want to take your seed and mix it with a carrier. So that can be sand or vermiculite or just something like that, and you just mix any volume you want to them, and it's just to help you broadcast it over an area. So you would just add as much carrier as you think you need to kind of effectively cover that spot a couple times, and you'll just make sure you get those seeds even over the surface. And you want to make sure your seed has good seed to soil contact. So if you imagine if you had mulched with a bunch of wood chips and then you put seed on it, they're not going to fare very well. They really want some soil contact. So, and that applies with leaves as well. So if you're using leaf mulch or something like that, you want to let it degrade into a soily matter before you're seeding into it. I strongly, strongly recommend sowing in fall. You'll have far superior results than if you sow in spring, even if it's early spring. So by fall, I mean anywhere from late August to mid-September really are the ideal times, but we sow September, October, sometimes November, depending on what the site and species mix is. But if it's your first time kind of sowing a meadow, you should just try to aim for being prepared for September. And keeping your the soil steadily moist until germination is important. So when you're sowing in fall, that's usually fairly simple to do once things start germinating. So you can purchase native seeds. So Saanich Native Plants is one of the nurseries that does that. And if you watch the second webinar we did, Planting for Pollinators, there's some other options for sourcing native plants and seeds. And if you're not able or willing to source native plants and seeds and you're collecting from the wild, please do so ethically. And that means different things to different people, but just keeping in mind that every remaining natural area is degraded, and we're already only left with a couple % of meadows that were there originally. So you really want to know what you're doing and not taking too much of a part of a population of a plant and so on. And you want to make sure you're not collecting in parks and collecting rare species and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes it really is just simpler for you to purchase an ethically produced native seed mix for your area. When you're sowing seed mixes, if you're purchasing a seed mix, whoever you're purchasing it from should be able to help you make an appropriate mix. For prairie oak ecosystems, people are usually using anywhere from 300 to 900 seeds in a metered square, approximately. So you'd be using fewer seeds if they're more vigorous species, and more seeds if the conditions are harsh, like a slope or super dry meadow, or if you're using species that aren't very vigorous. And the number in a single species, the number of seeds in a gram varies so greatly among different species, and that's just related to seed size. So some species have tiny little seeds that are very light, and some species have much larger seeds that are heavier. So if you imagine something like a yarrow seed compared to an acorn in a gram, that's going to be really, really variable. And everything all the thoughts that go, or all the thinking that goes into developing a seed mix really is all about the ecology of the plants themselves. And so you're thinking about the flowering period of the plant, the aggressiveness, when it flowers, and so on. And I'm not suggesting that everyone listening to this right now is gonna know all those things and put a mix together, but I just thought it might interest some folks to hear about that. And for pots, if you're planting plugs or 10-centimeter pots or that kind of thing, a general density would be for Garry Oak ecosystems is on the very light end, about 10 plants. And then usually we're planting more than 20 to 25 in a meter squared. And if you think about the behavior of Garry Oak ecosystem plants, many of them come out in the spring and then they die back below ground in the summer. And so what you're doing is you're putting in a mix of things that allows for enough density that you still have cover, even when some of those things have died back and then coming back the next year. So this is a good segue to the first poll. So here's a photo of a wildflower mix that we put together this morning, and it includes 7 different species, and we put it in a measuring cup so you get a good look at the volume of seed there. And we're wondering, what size area in metered squared do you think this mix could cover? And just as a helpful hint there, 100 metered squared is 1/3 the size of a tennis court, or equal to the size of 6 standard parking spots. So Thompson has just put a poll up for us. So looking at that volume of seed, I'm wondering, how big an area do you think you could cover with that? Thompson, do you mind putting on your microphone, and if you're able to view how many people have put their vote in and let me know, that would be great.
Yeah, totally. Right now we're at 60% here. So
Okay.
maybe give it like 10 more seconds or so.
So I'm very interested to see. Part of what I'm interested in is that a deceivingly small volume of seed can cover, well, I shouldn't be, now I feel like I'm giving things away. I'll let you answer and then I'll talk about it.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to end it now. We got 78
Okay.
here. Let's see.
Okay, cool. So the majority of people, there were 5 different options. The first option was 1 to 10 meters squared, that 9% thought it would cover. 10 to 30 meters squared, 22%. 30 to 100 meters squared, 38%. 100 to 150, 16%, and 150 to 200 meters squared, 16%. So the majority of folks thought that this mix could cover somewhere in between 30 and 100 meters squared, and the mix can cover 175 meters squared. So a pretty big area, and that's really generously. So with about 600 seeds in a meter per meter, this volume of seed could cover. And part of the reason I wanted to put this up is that a surprisingly small volume of seed can cover a really quite large area. We'll often see folks pick up their mix for a big site and be like, oh, that's it? Because the seeds are so small that it shows you using a carrier like sand is really important for covering larger areas as well. But thanks for answering that, and thanks, Thompson, for doing the poll. So I'm just trying to advance my screen. Okay, sorry, there we go. So a couple helpful tips. Keep things manageable. Site prep is very important. Plant densely enough. Use both perennials and annuals. Use both evergreen and deciduous species. Emphasizing the timing, again, September, October. Time the inclusion of potentially aggressive species. So this means if you're planning on including plants that might overtake other species, to maybe think about putting them in really low density, or putting them in future years, like year 2 or year 3, and then reiterating about planting species that make sense for your site. And annuals have a lot of function. So annuals like sea blush or blue-eyed Marys, adding them into a seed mix, I think, is really vital to having good cover, especially in those early years. So all these there, but that's what a meadow will look like in winter. So to keep your meadow thriving through time, you need to periodically remove buildup of material. So that's just grasses and other plant materials just falling and kind of smothering your meadow over time. So that top picture is just a torch. You can do something like that. And I know that doesn't appeal to everyone, but I thought I would show it as an option, because when you mimic fire like that, you don't disturb the soil, but you can get rid of biomass, and then things can really thrive. And then also you can mechanically remove through periodic, like mowing or weed whacking, and then these are just piles of the grasses and other things that have built up, and that's actually taken right out of the meadow. And what you'll find is that seeds are able to contact the soil more effectively. They warm early in the spring, and instead of just getting a big thick mat of grasses, you'll have a more diverse mixture of plants. And these activities should be done after seed set of the majority of species, and you don't necessarily want to do your whole meadow every single year. You might want to do different patches to make sure that invertebrates especially can thrive. So it'd be butterflies or nesting bees or things like that. And this picture is just showing how maintaining a meadow is a part of keeping a meadow thriving. So that includes weeding the meadow. I hear a lot about native plants don't need maintenance, and I don't really think it's true. I suppose it depends on the objectives, but in general experience shows there is some maintenance involved even when you're using native plants, and to expect that. So you're going to need to do some things to keep things in good shape, and that can just be some of the activities we've just talked about. And setting reasonable expectations. So here's the same spot over the course of 1 year. So there it is in kind of mid-spring, and then here's a summer shot of the same spot, and here's that spot in winter. So you need to expect all of those various phases on an annual basis, and that for a long time after you seed a meadow, that it's going to look like this, and not to get freaked out that nothing's happening. You have to be a bit patient. And everyone has different goals. Like even if you want to do a meadow, but maybe you don't want to rip everything out, you know, you just have to think about that a little bit can be a lot, can be a big improvement. So even just lawn is better than a parking lot. Keeping some dandelions blooming in as a lawn is better than just lawn. But then you can really step it up a bit quite simply by, you know, including some yarrow, just planting that right into grasses. And then this is more the kind of thing we're talking about where you go full board and kind of convert everything, like the whole lawn space, to a native meadow, and that's even more biologically friendly. So I know I'm getting a bit short on time here, so I'm going to try to speed things up by whipping through a few sample photos of projects. So these are some home or land stewards on their own properties who, you know, have essentially done all the work themselves with the kinds of techniques we've talked about. So I'm going to go through this first project that Silke Sommerfeld did at her property. So there she's prepared the area. You can see the seed mix is down, and that would be a winter shot. You can tell by the foliage around, but also the germination of the plants there. And there she is in her first spring. So that was just this past spring. So that's, you can get that kind of density and beautiful first spring. Another shot. You can see how abundant the annuals will be in the first year, and future years you'll get more perennials kind of filling in because some things take longer to mature. And there it is in summer. So lots of farewell to spring, and things will dry up. And then right around this time of year where she's got lots of yarrow and all that kind of stuff. So here's a second project. This is in Cowichan Valley with someone named Dale Kelly, who also prepared her site herself. So that was lawn. She ripped her lawn out. She prepared it. She planted camas bulbs ahead, so you can see your big camas there. And then she put a seed mix around some of those plants. And then the picture on the left there is the more wide view of what she had. So you can see her camas bulbs blooming in her other plants. She has lupins and buttercups and other things. And a summer shot, so you can see yarrow and self-heal and some of the grasses. Here's an example of property in Fairfield. So he ripped out his lawn, put soil down, and then added some potted things, but mostly seed. And that's the first spring. I'm going to quickly show you, I just have a few, if you look at the presentation, Planting for Pollinators, we go into a bit more depth with plants you can use, but I just wanted to show you a few images of some of the plants that are common to use for these meadows. So annual species, field chickweed, spring gold, broadleaf shooting star, and western buttercup with common camas would be a beautiful spring assemblage. Then in the early to mid-season, you have bare stem desert parsley or gukneen, great camas, California oatgrass, and woolly sunflower. And you can plant these all together. It'll give you that kind of succession of blooms. And this, we're still in kind of that mid-season with sticky cinquefoil and long stolen sedge. Then getting into the later season, you could plant something like self-heal, nodding onion, yampa, and yarrow. So yampa is not quite blooming yet, but yarrow is in full bloom right now. And you want to think about keeping some evergreen cover as well. So you can do that through annuals, like we've talked about, that germinate in the fall and stay green through the winter. Bunch grasses will do that, and strawberries are also a really wonderful way to do that, to have some evergreen cover in your meadow. If you have a moist or wet spot, you can also do meadow plantings. So here's slim leaf onion. These pictures are actually the same plant, just in different phases. Here's springbank clover, blue-eyed grass, and few flowered shooting star. So these would be areas that are wet through the winter. It doesn't mean they have to be wet in the summer, but wet in the winter. Here's large leaf lupin and goldenrod, fool's onion, and mountain sneezeweed or helenium. And a quick profile project who sowed a mix that was more on the wet end. So this spot is actually quite soggy. And Jennifer was having problems with deer and rabbits. So she fenced her area. She tore out the grass, covered it with weed-free soil, and sowed it last fall. And this is what her first spring looks like. And it'll get, you know, the first year is monkey flower and sea blush blooming, and that'll get much more diverse through time as well. So I can't wait to see what it looks like next year. And there are a suite of deer resistant species, and please look to, we have a plant list on the Saanich Native Plants resources page. And I also just made a couple posts about deer resistant plants on Facebook and Instagram just this past week that can help you choose plants that are deer resistant. But nodding onion and all the sedges, rushes, and grasses are species like yarrow and woolly sunflower are all things to consider if deer are an issue for you. You can have a diverse planting space even if they are. And just a quick comment, these last couple slides are just noting how for larger spaces, and if you're in collaborations with other people or that sort of thing, there's so many applications for meadows. So here's a project we helped with called Harvest for Knowledge, and this was an Indigenous communities-based project in partnership with School District 61, where you're looking at Vic High and other schools where Indigenous plant meadows were planted. And here's Bianca Elliott at the Sartlip Health Center, and she's one of our speakers next week, but she did a beautiful meadow in her community and does a lot of education around the species and wildlife that are in that space as well. And then just to end off, a few photos from the Lochside Pollinator Meadow that was done in partnership with Pollinator Partnership Canada and Peninsula Stream Society on BC Hydro land. So if you're a land manager with quite a large parcel, I hope that these images make you feel encouraged to do something similar with the space that you have as well. So here's little Zach proud with his pots and a community of people who are planting native plants into a well-prepared meadow area. That's what it looked like during that first winter after the seeding and planting. And then by that first spring, we had really good cover, so that will inhibit non-native plants from germinating and is also really beautiful. We had vernal pool areas, so we dug down a bit to hold more moisture. So we had a distinctive seed mix we put there, and a characteristic suite of species for vernal pools. And then this year, some of the wonderful diversity of plants thriving in that meadow space. And then just recently, Laura was in the Times Columnist with a nice photo doing some bee collections and observations there. And some summer shots, and just a reminder about these are cyclical spaces, and will not constantly be blooming in the winter. And that's it. And apologies for going a bit over time there. And I can't wait to hear from Amy now. She's going to talk to us about the Garry Oak Learning Meadow at Fort Rod Hill. And thanks very much for listening today.
All right, hi folks. Just going to get my screen ready here. Oops. Okay. There we go. Okay. So hi folks, we do apologize that we are a bit behind schedule. We recognize that this webinar is probably going to go over time in order for me to do my presentation and then for us to have the questions. If you do have to leave at 2:30, we completely understand, that's fine. The recording of the webinar will be posted online, so you can always come back later and view the second half if you need to. But since we're here and you're registered, we're going to go ahead with this presentation, and then we'll have the question and answers at the end. So as Kristen mentioned, I'm going to give a case study today of the Garry Oak Learning Meadow at Fort Rod Hill and just talk a little bit more about the restoration techniques we use there in depth and about the project in general and the creation of community around the Garry Oak Learning Meadow that we created. So just to situate you a little bit, Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse National Historic Sites is in the West Shore community, so in Colwood. You can see it here, located next to Esquimalt Lagoon. Here's another shot of it, just showing the sort of layout of the land. You can see that there's lots of natural areas, but there's also a fair amount of disturbed lawn area. It's actually two National Historic Sites, so Fort Rod Hill National Historic Site, which was established in the late 1800s to defend the Victoria Harbor, or sorry, I should say Esquimalt Harbor, and was operational all the way until the 1950s. And then Fisgard Lighthouse, which is the first permanent lighthouse on Canada's west coast. This shows here where the Garry Oak Learning Meadow is located. So it's in sort of a treed and also open meadow site of the historic site. And here's an overhead shot. So it also includes a footprint of a nursery where we grow native plants. Just to take a step back a little bit, this is the entranceway to the Garry Oak Learning Meadow taken more recently when all the plants have grown up. But I wanted to point out that Fort Rod Hill and Fisgard Lighthouse are on the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, which are known as the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. And this carving was commissioned. The carver was Tom LaFortune, who's from Sayout First Nation, but it was carved on Songhees Nation land in the carving tent. And it's meant to welcome people to the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people. It includes a male figure on the left and a female figure on the right. And then across the top, there's some of the culturally important species that are found in Garry Oak ecosystems, including camas and deer and what's called gachmeen or bare stem desert parsley. And this photo here shows our good friend Cheryl Bryce, who's from Songhees Nation, with a whole container full of camas there that is getting ready for a traditional pickup that we had at Fort Rod Hill in 2018. This is one of our signs that we have in the Garry Oak Learning Meadow that speaks to the rich cultural and natural landscape that Garry Oak ecosystems are. So they're known, Cheryl refers to them as Quetlal food systems or camas food systems. They're rich natural and cultural landscapes. You can consider them to be really living pieces of history. The Esquimalt and Songhees Nation, they consider the plants and animals that are found in Garry Oak Meadows to be gifts passed down from ancestors. And Garry Oak Meadows have been stewarded and have an intimate relationship with First Nations people that date back thousands of years, as Kristen mentioned. They were at one time burned seasonally, and there was various methods that were used to enhance Quetlal food systems for harvestable species like camas, which was an important trade item. To learn more about Indigenous stewardship of these ecosystems, we are going to be having a webinar next Tuesday that's been given by Bianca Elliott, who is of Saanich and Songhees ancestry. And she'll be talking more about Indigenous stewardship. So I encourage you to tune into that presentation. So as Kristen mentioned, the Garry Oak Learning Meadow is an example of blank slate restoration. There were some existing native species in some areas, and we made efforts to conserve those, but for the most part, we were converting areas that were lawn, and the site size is 1 acre. Just some of the background objectives for our Learning Meadow. We wanted to provide a site for visitors to learn about Garry Oak ecosystems. So people come to Fort Rod Hill generally to learn about the Esquimalt Naval Base or to see Fisgard Lighthouse, but we really wanted to interpret a longer timeline of history and to showcase what would have been originally on the landscape. We also wanted to serve as an urban demonstration site for how you can rewild degraded habitat and how that can benefit all sorts of things from pollinators to birds, to other species, including people. And we also wanted to have an outdoor classroom for schools and volunteers to participate in place-based learning, ecological restoration, and citizen science. And here's just a few pictures of some of the groups that we've had visit the Garry Oak Learning Meadow over time. So university classes often come to learn about restoration, but we've also offered school programs for elementary and middle school and high school years. So a bit about the site planning and sort of the baseline preparation that we did for the site. So this map just shows some of the mapping that we did. It was a large part of the site, about half the site, was sort of wide open sunny meadow. It had been mowed by the site for probably 30 to 30 years or so, so it was quite compacted and was mostly non-native species. There were also, the ground had been disturbed before, so there's various underground utilities. There's terracotta drainage pipes, so it was common practice to drain areas in the past to make them less wet. So chances are that this area used to be a lot wetter than it is now. It was also, because it's a historic site, our ability to disturb the ground is very limited, and it's not considered appropriate to do in most cases because of the cultural history at the site. And then we also had about half the site was an existing canopy of mature trees. So things like Garry Oak, Douglas fir, grand fir, big leaf maple, and black hawthorn. Half the site was a meadow, and we also had a small rock outcrop. And we chose this site because it was right by the entranceway to the site. The main visitor pathway down to the lighthouse goes right by it. So by having it there, we could encourage people to come in and learn about Garry Oak ecosystems. Here's a few of the pictures before the before restoration. So this is the meadow looking down towards Fisgard Lighthouse, the little rock outcrop, and the woodland area. So as Kristen mentioned, it's important to map your site ahead of time, to get to know it well, to consider what plants will be good for the site, to observe it throughout different seasons so you know which areas get sun and which areas get shade and which areas are well drained and which areas collect water. So this was sort of our first naturescape plan that we created. So we plotted where the trees were and where we had water sources because we had a conservation nursery, so we needed to water our plants there. We also mapped site characteristics, and we identified target plant communities. And to do that, we had to do a lot of research. We consulted local experts. We brought together we had like an expert workshop at the site where we walked around with people more knowledgeable than ourselves to help identify what kind of plants would go in the area. And I just wanted to point out that one resource is the biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification system. So it's called, the BEC program basically, and you can access it online. There's one for Garry Oak and associated ecosystems, and it's a great place to learn about what different sites or what different ecosystem types look like, and also gives plant lists for species found in those ecosystems. So we use that to sort of identify our target plant communities. We also identified locations to put shrub thickets, and if you were participated in last week's webinar about creating hedgerows, that goes into more detail, but we basically wanted to put them strategically along the edges of the meadow to create a barrier between the rest of the lawn, which was still being mowed and full of weedy species, and the meadow to try to keep sort of seed rain out. We also didn't want to obscure sight lines down to the lighthouse, so we had to be strategic with where we put them. And finally, we wanted to put in an interpretive pathway, so we mapped out where that would go. So Kristen mentioned a variety of different site preparation methods. The one that we used was sheet mulching. We selected that one because we didn't want to use herbicides. It was because we were wanting to do the acre all at once. We weren't really wanting to do solarization and the sort of volume of plastic that would create. And so we settled on sheet mulching. And the reason for that is because we were able to access municipal leaf mulch from both the City of Victoria and the District of Oak Bay. This brings us to our poll, because I'm curious to know, and hopefully Thomas can help us out here with our second poll. How much leaf mulch do you think it will take to mulch an acre of lawn to a depth of 6 to 8 inches? And so there's a couple of different options there for you to vote on. I'll wait a couple of seconds. So 50 to 100 yards, 100 to 500 yards, 500 to 1,000, or 1,000 to 1,500 yards. And Thompson, if you can let me know too when the webinar wraps, or when the poll wraps up. Thank you.
Sounds good. Everyone's voting quite quickly here. We're at 70%. So I'll give it maybe 10 more seconds and then you should be good to go.
Okay, so the answers are here up on the screen. The majority of people, 52%, think 500 to 1,000 yards. Yeah, and then there's the broad spectrum. So the answer, you can close the poll there, Thompson. The answer is 1,360 yards. So the last one, 1,000 to 1,500 yards, was the correct answer. So I tried to figure that out. It's about 6,000 wheelbarrow loads full. We had it delivered in giant disposal bins from the District of Oak Bay and from the City of Victoria. We also acquired a bunch of cardboard. And we did that mostly from Trail Appliances, gave us big refrigerator boxes. And so here's a couple of pictures of the site preparation. We mainly laid the cardboard down, as much as cardboard as we could get in the sunny area of the meadow, and just mulch the rest of the site quite deeply with leaf mulch. Somebody asked a question about how much cardboard. We tried to put down 2 layers, and that seems to be plenty if you have good thick cardboard. And I think one of the real successes of the creation of the meadow is that it helped create a lot of community around a cause. And so staff from the historic site helped us out spreading the mulch with the tractor. We had weekly volunteer events on Saturdays where folks came out and helped us with wheelbarrows. When we got our second load delivered, we actually hired a landscaper to help us with this bobcat, and we had school groups. So this is a cadets group that came and helped us out. It was kind of stinky, smelly work, but it was also a lot of fun. So here's just one of the pictures in the fall after the sheet mulching. And another person has mentioned this. We did have to put up a deer fence around the acre because there are so many deer locally. And we wanted the plants to have a chance to establish without that herbivory pressure. So we use this Benner's deer fence system. We chose it because from a distance, it tends to sort of disappear in the background. So it's not visually obtrusive and it doesn't obstruct sight lines. And here's a picture of our new trail going in. So sourcing native plants, that's something that we did cover a lot in our second webinar on selecting plants for pollinators. We used a variety of different methods. As you can imagine, trying to fill an acre takes a lot of plants. We established a nursery on site, which I will speak to in a bit more detail later, but we grew a lot of plants in the nursery. We also live staked native shrubs, which involves taking dormant hardwood cuttings in the winter when the shrubs are dormant, and then putting a little bit of rooting hormone on them, and then actually pounding them into the ground so that 2/3 of the stake is buried. And then some of our shrubs actually take quite well doing that. We also use direct seeding. So we collected some seed from natural areas at Fort Rod Hill and from other natural areas around Victoria. This was before the existence of Saanich Native Plants, so we didn't actually have a good ethically sourced location of native plant seed to purchase from. But we only collected small amounts, and then we had that contract grown by local nurseries and then planted the seedlings or the plugs into the site. And we also purchased wholesale from local native plant nurseries like Saanich Native Plants, Thimbles, Fraser's Thimbles Farm, Streamside Native Plants, and Knapp's Nursery on the mainland. Again, planting was a great way to build community. There's a picture at the top left of mature camas bulbs that we were able to get from a native plant nursery up island. The picture on the bottom left is of my son Zachary when he was only about 3 years old, and he's got a little truckload of common camas bulbs that he's planting. It was a great way to build community with volunteers as well, and we had lots of school groups help us out. I wish that I could have seen, or that we could have seen, Kristen's presentation prior to starting this meadow project back in 2011, because we were fairly new to this, and we definitely learned as we were going along. Things like keeping the seed bank buried is really important, and when you do plant camas bulbs into leaf mulch, if you're a bit too enthusiastic, you can end up going through the leaf mulch into the old seed bed and then bringing seeds up. So that definitely happened in our case. So it's great that we have this local community, and we're learning as we can go along and learn from each other's successes and challenges. Here's some before and progression photos of the meadow. So 2014, these were those camas bulbs were the mature bulbs that we planted. So again, we did want to sort of see results right away and not have to wait the 7 years for the camas to grow from seed to flower. So that's why we planted in mature bulbs and then seeded in some of the other faster growing species like Western buttercup and field chickweed and sea blush. This photo was taken in 2017, so more of a mature meadow, sort of 4 years on. You can see lots of sea blush and western buttercup, mature camas, some woolly sunflower. And again, the yellow is western buttercup. A lot of people think that buttercups locally are invasive, but the western buttercup is one of our native species, so it's not the same as the creeping buttercup, and it is a lovely native meadow species. And then sea blush. And this is another photo. My son is in the middle there, so he's gotten a little bit bigger, so he's seen this meadow grow through the years, which is really rewarding. So some of the specific things that we did to create habitat for pollinators and other wildlife, I just wanted to cover briefly. So we put in some coarse woody debris. So when Garry Oak limbs fell around site, or they were taken down by the site for like limbing and safety measures, then we would add those into the meadow, especially the woodland, just to have some coarse woody debris because we had just started with lawn. We also let sort of the oak leaves naturally fall and the leaf mulch collects, and we also mulch certain areas, and leaf mulch is used by, well, many sort of, some of our native butterflies overwinter in oak leaf mulch. In this picture, there's a bumblebee. Native bunch grasses, and again, those can be really important habitat for our ground nesting native bees. Often will nest sort of around the base of native bunch grasses. More recently, we started building some raised beds, and instead of using wood, we use rocks, and it creates sort of a natural rock wall. And we're noticing that we get things like mason bees and leafcutter bees that are sort of building their cocoons within the crevices of the rock walls, and that's what's shown in the picture here. And then it's also really important to leave areas of bare ground where you can for ground nesting bees. And of course, when I think we've talked about this in the past, a lot of our native bees also will use hollow or pithy plant stems. So leaving plant stems over the fall and winter is a good way to create habitat and conserve those native bees. And here's just a shot of some degrading oak stumps that have been used by carpenter bees to lay their eggs in. So again, woody debris can be a good thing to add to your meadow. And here's a picture of a mourning cloak butterfly just resting on one of our sort of rock pathways. If you want to know more about what kind of pollinators we are finding in the Garry Oak Learning Meadow and sort of follow along, you can look at inaturalist.ca. You can download it on your mobile device and make your own observations, but you also can just view it on your computer. And if you follow us at Growing Together, then you'll see what we've been seeing in the meadow lately. And my colleague Nathan Fisk put this together. He's been sort of keeping track of all the different pollinators that we've been seeing in the meadow. And this just shows sort of the diversity of what we've seen so far, mostly bombus, so bumblebees, but lots of Megachilidae, so leafcutter bees as well, and other species. So, and we are going to be having a pollinator later on in the season about identifying and monitoring pollinators when we'll talk more about that. So just quickly, the meadow has also created habitat for a lot of birds because of the native hedgerows that we have and the variety of different habitats. We get red-tailed hawks coming in and hunting voles in the meadow. Robins are always ubiquitous, and spotted towhees as well. Killdeers in the wintertime, and goldfinches really like visiting our conservation nursery and collecting some of our seeds for us. And then, yeah, just some of the shots from the meadow. All that coarse woody debris creates lots of beautiful fungi. So one of the things to consider when you are building a meadow is how to create blooms across the whole season. So you want things that bloom early in the season for some of our early pollinators, and then that go all the way into the fall. So just going to feature a couple of other early season things. So things like red flowering currant and tall Oregon grape are used by Anna's hummingbirds quite early on. Sea blush is a favorite of many bumblebees. Henderson's shooting star is quite early, as is white fawn lily. And you can see a Sarah's orange tip butterfly visiting our white fawn lily. So as you progress into the spring, things come into bloom like nodding onion, great camas, and camas is wonderful to watch because it has so much pollen, so it's really neat to watch the bees sort of just strip the pollen off and carry it away. Woolly sunflower blooms for a long time and supports a diversity of pollinators. Grassland saxifrage, I don't think that one is mentioned yet, but it's a pretty species. And then late season, so things like Oregon gumweed, yarrow, goldenrod, harvest brodea even, with a little skipper butterfly on it. Douglas aster, which is blooming now, and white top aster, which is a species of special concern, but is definitely favored by a lot of skipper butterflies. And then we also have a fairly wet area of the meadow where water collects during the winter time. So that's enabled us to plant some more wet meadow species, things like Henderson's checker mallow and mountain sneezeweed, which are blooming now. And as I mentioned, we did put in a lot of shrub thickets, and you can see in this picture, the shrubs have grown a lot now. So that creates a lot of habitat for birds. A lot of our native butterflies also use some of our shrubs as host plants for the caterpillar stage. So here's just some progressing through the season. June plum is, it's also called fool's plum because it's one of the earliest plants to flower in Garry Oak Meadows, but the fruit doesn't ripen until quite late. And also the little tiny plums on it have giant pits and aren't very palatable. So it's also called fool's plum, but that one blooms really early. Red flowering currant sort of comes out in February and is quite stunning and really attracts hummingbirds. Nootka rose, which is one of our native rose species, is really important for pollinators and also provides delicious petals and rose hips. Ocean spray, which is finishing blooming now, but it's used by a lot of our native butterflies. Red elderberry, I mentioned this one because it has pithy stems, and we've noticed that bees have, like carpenter bees have drilled holes in the sides of the stems and put some of their cocoons there, built some of their cocoons there. Mock orange, which is blooming now, is really beautiful. Tiger swallowtail butterflies will nectar on this plant, and it smells really lovely. And hardhack is one that blooms in a wetter area of our meadow. Again, it's quite beautiful. So just a few pictures before and after of a rock outcrop. So this is what it looked like in September 2012, and then the following spring when we'd seeded in blue-eyed Mary and sea blush. And then here's some photos of our woodland. And I know we're talking about more meadows today, but since half our site is woodland, I also wanted to mention it too. So again, what it looked like when it was mulched. And then further along, you can see we've planted some sword ferns in that area. And then this is a more recent photo. And mostly what you're seeing here is Siberian miner's lettuce, which is also called candy stripe. It's got a really beautiful flower, and it blooms for a long time, and it's visited by many pollinators. We also have a lot of white fawn lily in the meadow, red columbine, a really nice native plant called Nettles toothwort, which blooms very early, and chocolate lily are some of the other ones. All right, I just wanted to mention our conservation nursery. So this is where Parks Canada grows a lot of different native plants. Originally, it was for the Garry Oak Learning Meadow. Now we focus more on growing culturally important plants that we can, so that we can provide sort of safe harvesting and sort of clean harvesting sites for things like camas to some of our First Nations partners. And we also grow a lot of species at risk that help with Parks Canada's species at risk recovery projects. So here's a shot of a nursery showing some of our camas propagation beds, and then we also have seed beds for things like sea blush and other annuals. So again, I mentioned objectives are to support recovery of species at risk and also provide sort of harvesting opportunities. And just along the bottom here, there's some pictures from left to right of camas bulbs, of strawberry, and of gachmeen or consumption plant. So one of the main species that we focused on propagating in the early days was camas. because it is such an iconic species and because it's a culturally important plant. So this photo just shows sort of the progression from seed to mature bulbs. And again, that takes 7 to 8 years, so a lot of patience. But now we're sort of at the point where we can actually harvest mature camas bulbs. And to celebrate this and to celebrate the work that we've done together with Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and here's just some photos of our camas beds through the years. We had a pit cook demonstration in October 2018. This was led by Cheryl Bryce, who's a Quetlel knowledge keeper for Songhees Nation. And we were actually able to pit cook some of the camas that we've grown in the nursery and share that with community members. Some folks had never tasted camas before, and for those that had, it's always a treat. And it also allowed us to sort of for Songhees and Esquimalt Nation to have the opportunity to celebrate together and also share their culture with the community. And we also cooked salmon around a fire and a lot of conventional root vegetables as well, because camas is so, well, it's not as abundant as it used to be. So their pit cooks these days tend to mainly be cultivated root vegetables. So the meadow has also been a site for species at risk recovery, and this just shows some of the progression for recovering deltoid balsam root, which is an endangered plant found in Garry Oak ecosystems. It would have been at one time much more common in the Victoria area, but now it's restricted to just a few small populations remaining in rocky outcrop sites. So we wanted to use the Garry Oak Learning Meadow as a location where we could try to create a population of the species. We created a nursery population as well, which is what's featured here, where we'd be able to collect seeds, which we can then use to grow plugs, and then we plant those plugs out in the meadow and then elsewhere on the site. So again, it's a species that takes a number of years to recover, but we've now had our first mature blooming species in the Fort Rod Hill lands that were planted by us. So that was very exciting. And here's a few other species at risk that we propagate. Golden paintbrush, which again is endangered in Canada, only grows in a couple of places on small islands off of Victoria and nowhere else in Canada. So we're trying again to reestablish populations. We're trying to establish a population in Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. We're also working with the City of Victoria as they try to establish a population in one of the City of Victoria parks. And then white top aster, we also grow, and there's a skipper butterfly on here. It's always full of skippers at this time of year. And then finally, we have the sand bed where we're growing contorted pod evening primrose, which is a coastal sand species. And that's because we grow seeds for taking to Gulf Islands National Park Reserve to Sydney Spit, where we have a restoration project trying to restore the coastal sand habitats there and reintroducing or trying to, well, expand the population of this endangered plant species. So I just wanted to go through a few of the challenges involved in maintaining the Garry Oak Learning Meadow over time. And Kristen did touch on quite a few things. So one caution, when you're getting municipal leaf mulch, as you know, it's just collected from curbside. So it can contain a variety of weeds, often contains blackberry. We've had pansies and lemon balm pop up in it. So you do have to be conscious of the fact that it's going to contain weeds and sort of manage for that. It can also come with a lot of garbage. So over the years, we've had to sort of clean out a lot of plastic wrappers and variety of things. We found all sorts of bizarre things that came with the mulch. So now we tend to try to collect our own Garry Oak leaf mulch from on site. When the site has to clear the pathways for the public, when they leaf blow, we collect that leaf mulch and then use it in our meadow. But this just shows an area where we're trying to smother with landscape cloth because it had a lot of weeds in it. The other challenge is that we mulch the entire acre all at once with not having all of our plants ready. And so we sort of had some areas that we were planting while other areas were already decomposing into soil. So we use this technique of putting down tarps to try to smother those areas until we had plants to plant there. One thing that we did not anticipate is that sheet mulching would actually attract raccoons. And so in our early days of the meadow, we had a lot of raccoons visit, and they would, when we plant native plants out into the meadow, they would actually come during the night and dig them all up looking for grubs. And so that was quite distressing for a while, and we tried a variety of different things to deter the raccoons. In the end, we ended up putting these low electric mesh fencing in for a period of about a year. And that really did solve the problem overnight and allowed our areas to get established. And then we were able to take those electric mesh fencing out. But it really was sort of a desperation measure, because we wouldn't have been able to plant the area with the raccoons continuing to till it every night. Kristen also mentioned maintenance of the meadow. If you just leave a meadow be, it's going to slowly transition to grass, and the thatch will build up, and you won't have that seed to soil contact that you want. So historically, these areas would have been burned seasonally by the Lekwungen and Saanich people. We haven't received permission to burn at this site yet. So we try to mimic burning through doing seasonal mowing and raking of the area. So this is just showing an area where we've mowed. And as Kristen mentioned, we try to mow different areas every year to create patchiness on the landscape, and that's better for pollinators and also for ground nesting bird species as well. So we don't mow the whole site, just sort of patches. Another challenge that we have being a Parks Canada site where we have visitors coming to is seasonality. So our Garry Oak Meadows always look really amazing in May and even in June, but by the time you come to July, they're a lot, they just look different. They're more golden, we've got tall grasses in them. And for Parks Canada, that can be a challenge because our peak visitor season coincides with when our meadows look sort of brown and not as exciting. So one of the things we try to do is interpretation. So this is one of our signs where we talk about seasonality in Garry Oak Meadows and how even if it looks sort of brown and dry, there are things happening, ground nesting birds, butterflies nesting, bees nesting. And we encourage people to come back and try to see it in different seasons. I encourage you guys, if you have a chance, to go on Google Street View. We've actually started uploading some photospheres from the Garry Oak Learning Meadow, so you can have just like a virtual look around and see what it looks like. This is an image from this previous spring that my colleague Nathan Fisk uploaded, and you can also explore in the meadow on Google Earth, but the Google Earth imagery was captured in 2013, I believe, so you'll be able to see a meadow in a very early state. But this is one of the other ways we can try to tell visitors and show visitors what the meadow looks like at other times of the year. Finally, there are some native plants that are quite aggressive and will take advantage of sort of mulched area or sort of new space. So we've noticed things have sort of changed throughout the years. The meadow will be different every season. In our early years, we had a lot of miner's lettuce that would basically just covered sort of all the mulched areas, and it was at a point where it was sort of out competing things like white fawn lily. So we had to develop some techniques to try to smother these areas and convert them back to sort of a more diverse mix of species. So that's where collecting our own oak leaf mulch came into play, and also using smothering. So this is just an example of placing down cardboard, or you can use landscape fabric or pond liner or just heavy leaf mulch. You put down the mulch in November, take it up again in January, and that gives you sort of a space to then plant other plants into. There's an example of what it looks like. And here's just an example of blue-eyed Mary. So that's the blue species here, and we've sown it into areas where that we had mulched previously, so that basically it's trying to create space for those annuals in the meadow. So you can use a variety of different techniques to do that. And finally, as Kristen mentioned, native plant or meadow communities do require maintenance and interaction with people. So we have a Meadow Steward program. Volunteers come on Tuesday mornings from 10 to noon and help us with meadow maintenance tasks. They vary throughout the year. Sometimes it's planting, sometimes it's weeding, collecting seed or cleaning seed, or raking mulch. So if you are interested in that program, currently because of COVID, we aren't accepting volunteers, but when we are able to safely welcome volunteers again, we would love to see you. It's a great way to learn about more about Garry Oak ecosystems and how to maintain them. All right, thank you, folks. We will have the Q&A period. We do recognize that this went long and folks probably had to leave us, but if anybody did stick around for the question period, we will do that right now.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thanks, Kristen. So yeah, we'll spend a few minutes going through some of these questions now. There's some really good questions that have come in, and we'll just do this for about 15 minutes, and then we'll announce the two award winners. If you are one of the winners, please email one of us. I'm Laura Miranda, lm@pollinator.org, or any of the emails that you have there. Okay, so I'm going to look back at the questions here, starting from some of the early ones. We have one from Sharon here that's interesting. Smothering couch grass and sorrel doesn't seem to affect the rhizotomous type growth. How do you manage these underground problematic species? And then there was a follow-up question, or a follow-up, some information from Sharon that she's tried with tarp and plastic and an old carpet and removing the rhizomes manually, and 20 years later still have both species.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sharon. And thanks, Laura, but thanks, Sharon, for your question. So couch grass, or I think it's the synonym with quackgrass, and that's Elamis repens. So if I'm talking about the same thing there, we have experienced the same issues with that species. And so have other land managers, like I know Colleen O'Brien at Playfair Park has struggled with that species, and it's a rhizomatous, hugely mat forming species, and you can kind of set it back year to year through smothering, but you do experience like regrowth with it continually. So Colleen and other land managers are sometimes using herbicides to treat areas where there's really important species there for conservation. And so a herbicide treatment in those cases can be used. And but in terms of like effective smothering of it, if you can imagine a rhizome patch, if any bit of that plant is outside the smothering material, it's photosynthesizing and sending energy back into that rhizome mat. And so I don't know an effective way to eradicate that species using organic techniques. And then for sorrel, so I think what you're probably referring to is Rumex acetosella, which is wood sorrel. And it's a species that isn't nearly as competitive. And I'm not sure how you're experiencing that species, but what we found is through more competition in the native plantings, we've been able to kind of get rid of that plant, or almost get rid of it, or it's not competing that effectively with what we're putting in. So if we're talking about the same plant, but Amy or Paige, do you have anything to add with Elamis repens there?
I don't know if I have anything specific about that species, but I was going to say that there are some pretty great new techniques that are coming out for other rhizomatous species, like yellow flag iris, where they kind of do a similar thing where they send out like the rhizomes and then they pop up again in different spots. And that one, the emphasis was on making sure you smother the entire potential patch that could be connected by rhizomes, because if you have any that could potentially get to the light, then they're gonna sort of transfer nutrients to each other. And so that could be a real challenge, but that technique uses the pond liner, or they call it the benthic barrier method is another version. And I'm not sure, I don't have experience with using that on other species, but could be something to look into.
Yeah, the one species that we have familiarity with is creeping St. John's wort. So I can't think of the name of the species off the top of my head, but it's called creeping St. John's wort, and it's the same thing, and we were trying to prevent it from invading into a natural area. And so what we did is we created a wide strip of pond liner sort of at the edge of it to act as sort of a barrier. And then if anything pops up on the other side of that, then we sort of weed it aggressively. And thus far, it's been able to sort of stop the advance of that species. So I'm not as familiar with couch grass or crabgrass, but there are sort of places where you can use, for example, grass-specific herbicide in some cases.
Okay, thank you all. A question from Nathan, and I bet Nathan has a lot of experience with this. Okay, but I think it would be interesting for a lot of people is how thick and how many layers of cardboard is used for sheet mulching?
Yeah, that was something we probably should have mentioned. I'd be interested to hear from you, Amy, but I'll just comment for 1 second that I normally just use 1 layer, but of like what I call good cardboard. So big bike boxes that don't have staples or tape, or appliance boxes. So they're effectively covering a large area and you're making sure it's overlapping well. And then giving a nice few inches of whatever you're topping that with. And ahead of putting sheet mulching down, if let's say it's tall, weedy grasses or something like that, mowing that quite flush so that ahead of the cardboard going down, it's going down onto a flat-ish surface can be a bit more effective. But yeah, I use 1 layer, but I can't see how multiple layers could be more effective in some cases if the species are vigorous.
Yeah, that's our experience too. We just used sort of the 1 layer, it overlapped in some cases. But then we did top it, because we were topping with leaf mulch, we did top it by a good 6 to 8 inches of leaf mulch. And I should have pointed out the leaf mulch we used wasn't composted at the time, so it did take a while to break down, and we couldn't plant into it right away.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions here on seeding and how much might be lost. So 2 separate questions, but they kind of come down to how much is going to get eaten by various animals possibly, and then would you need to compensate for that, and then run off if you get heavy rains in the winter.
Or Laura, I missed the first part. You cut out for a second for me. I'm sorry. I did hear about the heavy rains in winter, but I missed the first part.
Yeah, so in terms of seed loss by getting eaten by various animals, squirrels, raccoons, birds, etc., and then runoff of seed from your site if there's heavy rains. So if you could talk to that, and if you need to compensate for that.
Yeah, so with raccoons, Amy already mentioned that in her presentation. So maybe we won't go into that again, because they certainly are curious creatures, and we'll do digging. We do have had issues with eastern gray squirrels if it's like larger structures like acorns or something like that. So we will in some cases protect things like that. And then the smaller seeds in more of a seed mix format, to be honest with you, I haven't really on a larger scale, so even like a lawn or something like that, experience very many issues in that way, even with birds. In smaller containers I do, but not on the bigger sowings. But I think that if somebody is experiencing issues with birds, they're noticing like a lot of activity and they're concerned that the birds are going to eat all that seed. You can get what's called insect netting, and it just comes on rolls and is quite large. So if you had, you know, sown a patch and you think it's feasible to cover because the patch isn't big, the insect netting allows all the moisture and light and air flow through. And that's really important. You don't want to cover your seeds with something that's going to block any of those things, because you won't have effective germination that way. So Amy, have you had any issues with predation from birds? I just, before Amy moves on there, I do experience issues with slugs, but one of the main issues isn't really biotic, it's frost heaving. So you'll sow seeds in September, the ground will get moist through the fall. You have these tiny little plants and you'll get a frost and the water expands in the soil and it'll actually like lift your seedlings, exposing root, and then it'll freeze and it'll dry things out. And that can be a concern. So one of the most important things to do is to ensure you're sowing early in the fall, that the species that do germinate in fall are growing through that fall season and are as established as they can be ahead of any of these other factors that could impact them over the winter.
Yeah, I would say our experience is similar, and we've definitely noticed that effect of sort of frost heaving and losing a bunch of our sort of seedlings in January when we sort of have deep freezes. So sowing early is a good idea. I wanted to point out that one of the challenges too, so sometimes we smother areas that have camas bulbs in them already, so we smother them in from November to January, which doesn't impact the camas bulbs, but can help us control some weedy species. But one thing we have noticed with predation is that when we put those smothering cloths down, landscape fabric, for example, we do have voles that tunnel underneath, dig up our camas bulbs and collect them into certain areas. So we'll pull it up in the springtime and we'll find a whole collection of camas bulbs that are partially nibbled. So the voles are finding a nice predator-free space underneath the tarps. So yeah, that's another challenge you can run into. So welcoming raptors to your site, having perches for raptors is a good way to help control vole populations.
And adaptive management.
Great suggestions. Okay, so here's an interesting one, and one that I think all of us come up against a lot. Ariel says that they are planning to convert at least part of the front lawn to meadow. Any suggestions on working with neighbors to embrace this change from traditional lawn through educating and, you know, maybe even encouraging others to participate as well? I'll just start off on that by saying signage is a great way. We do have some on Pollinator Partnership. I know Hat has some signage as well, but that can be a good passive way to let people know what you're doing and that you're not just being lazy and not taking care of your lawn, that you're actually doing something for wildlife. But I'll open it up to the speakers as well, of course.
Amy, maybe you can comment on your boulevard work, and maybe Paige, you could touch on Hat's stewardship program.
Yeah, so I am in the process of converting my boulevard to a meadow as well. One of the things I did early on, we have like a street email list because we have block parties. And so I invited actually Kristen and Paige over, and we had a little impromptu boulevard gathering for other folks on our street. And we just chatted about what we were going to be doing and like sort of what it would look like over the course of the season and what kind of species might be there. And then also if they wanted to do it too, where they could find resources, and Kristen was able to send folks out some resources. I've also now referred them to this webinar series, so maybe they will get converted and want to do it too. And then the other day I put out a little bee box on my fence that has, it's one of those ones that opens up. And on one side you can have mason bees in it, and the other side for leaf cutter bees. So that's already created lots of people stopping by and asking questions. So it's just creating those opportunities for conversations.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of our habitat stewardship program at HAT, it's about a lot of similar ideas of getting the word out there through some signage. I think there's, at least through the experience that I've had, even with Amy's project and lots of other projects, there's a fair number of misconceptions about bees. You know, people are worried about stings, they're worried about ground nesting, wasps, and there's just a lot of uncertainties, I think, for folks. And so having a little bit of information for them, or, you know, creating maybe a Facebook group or an email list like Amy has, sort of a block-friendly, block watch style grouping of some variety so you can communicate with the folks. Otherwise, flyers in mailboxes work fairly well, and or, you know, knocking on doors. But yeah, just getting the word out there and looking at some of those options for, you know, grants, local grants, and we can share those as well. I know City of Victoria has one. Sorry, go ahead.
Kate, there was a question about local grants, municipal grants, or other incentives and help around meadow making. Do you want to, I probably interrupted you when you were going to say something. I'm sorry, but it just struck me because I did see that question.
Okay, good. Yeah, so there are some My Great Neighborhood grant through the City of Victoria, and I know the District of Saanich has a few sort of smaller grants, a couple $100 for residents who want to do, you know, nature-focused projects or education-focused projects, including planting native plants or pollinators or for other purposes. So there are little grants out there, and definitely check with the municipality you're in first, and that might tell you. And then from there, you can always email HAT, and we have a list of other ones as well.
Okay, thank you all. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. We're getting on to 3 o'clock now. And so we will, if you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to email us with your question if it didn't get answered. And we need to pick the 2 winners. So the Moderator's Choice Award and the Speaker's Choice Award. So I don't know if Amy or Kristen will be doing the Speaker's Choice. For
You choose, Kristen.
Well, I'm trying to find it here because I had an idea of what I liked earlier.
Okay, for the Moderator's Choice, though, while you're looking at that, Kristen, I'm going to pick Sharon because that was a good, challenging question, I think, for everybody about those rhizotomous species and getting a handle on them. And I think it's something that a lot of people deal with. So, Sharon, if you have Amy's email address, you can email her and let her know how to pick up how you're going to exchange the prize.
I'll just type that in the chat here.
Okay, great.
And I'm going with Bonnie Zand, who asked 2 really good questions. One was about a species selection for dry, compacted, and gravelly soils, which I answered. I just did it in the chat because I knew we were short on time. But I also appreciated her question about buffering on edges of meadows, and that's a really important concept that got overlooked. So I just commented to Bonnie that creating a buffer using sheet mulching, or even straight wood chips, or sometimes just using fabric, like landscape grade fabric around the perimeter, but thinking about protecting your meadow from everything that might be dropping seed into it or creeping into it, like creeping buttercup or quack grass or whatever it might be.
Okay, well, thank you all. And those were great presentations and great questions. You can view all the recordings through the Island Pollinator Initiative website, and keep an eye there for when we open up registration for the last half of the webinar series. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.